It's a great pleasure for Hayek and Bases Foundations to present Guido Hülsmann. He's a professor of the Université d'Angers from France, and well, he's an economist of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and he's one of the most important economists that we have today, I think, in the world. He writes a very important book on Mises. It's the last biography of Mises. Well, and let's hear it.
Thank you very much for this excellent introduction. I could not have stated it better. So now that you know that you have one of the most important economists, I would even say most important in the world, you should increase the speaking fees and the entrance fees. Okay, no, so it's very sweet. I appreciate this a lot. I do not believe it personally, but it's certainly nice to hear this.
I believe it.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you here tonight. This is my first trip to the southern hemisphere. I've never been south of the equator. The furthest I got into this direction was during my honeymoon, which I spent on the French island of Guadeloupe. And I have a terrible recollection of returning to Europe because we had air turbulences the entire time. It was kind of a rodeo ride. So I hope this time it will be better. And in any case, I had a smooth transition to Buenos Aires and now to this conference. It is, as my subject today is the question whether government regulation is necessary and or beneficial to solve the current financial crisis. It's a crisis that, as we all know, will not spend much time diagnosing the symptoms of the crisis that we have right now. It is worldwide, and it touches primarily the financial markets. For the moment, it has been solved. Well, or let's say a further deterioration has been prevented, essentially by two measures. One was the massive influx of money coming from sovereign funds. So, especially government money from China, the Gulf states, and various other places. Norway was, by the way, also a very big sovereign fund investor. And on the other hand, we had a massive bailout through the Federal Reserve System, which essentially swapped the defaulting assets of the American banking system against treasury bonds. Treasury bonds held by the Federal Reserve. An unheard of step, so we were all wondering what Professor Bernanke, the president of the Federal Reserve, had in mind when he announced unorthodox steps, unusual steps in case of a financial crisis, and now we are all that much smarter. We know what they did. And, well, of course, this was a real emergency measure. It is, of course, not a policy that we can pursue permanently. And so the question is still, right, how can we prevent something of this sort from happening again? What's the proper institutional response to the present crisis? That's the subject of my lecture. And in order to go about this, well, first of all, I will give you a rough working definition of regulation, which is the attempt of a government by creating an agency or by creating a task force to give directives to market participants of how to handle their affairs. So the two main things that regulators do is to grant licenses, professional licenses, and second, to regulate business practices, that is to determine which kinds of activities are lawful and which others are not. Now, based on this definition, we'll now first discuss briefly the causes of the present crisis, and then turn to the regulation of financial markets and raise the question whether this regulation is suitable as a response. And then in a third step, we will examine the unintended consequences, or in more detail discuss the unintended consequences of financial market regulation. So, step one, what are the causes of the present financial crisis? There is actually a huge agreement among economists as far as the immediate causes are concerned. Schools of thought on this question play no significant role. All economists agree that we have, as the immediate cause, the fragility of the financial industries, that is, financial firms and banks in particular operating at a high leverage, or otherwise said, at a low equity ratio. So the capital that they have invested is essentially financed by debts, liabilities, and only a very small portion comes out of their own funds, so low equity. In such a situation, the market is liable to contagion. Right? The failure of a more or less important market participant is likely to entail a domino effect on the rest of the market, because if one participant goes bankrupt, well, he will not be able to pay back his liabilities. That's the definition of bankruptcy. And because his liabilities are the assets of other companies, the balance sheets of these other companies also shrink, so their equity is eaten up, and as a consequence, they are likely to go bankrupt, and so on and so on. So like in a domino game, you have one bankruptcy entailing other bankruptcies. So on the financial markets, which are operating on low equity ratios, you have a contagion effect or a domino effect that can create a meltdown of the financial market. A second symptom is financial exuberance. That's a term that I have borrowed from our Keynesian colleagues, who also sometimes speak about the fairy tale financial market, fairy tale economy, and so on. And what they have in mind is that financial market participants have made investments without sufficient regard for the risks associated with these investments. So they have looked on the return side, the possible returns, and neglected the possible losses, or the cost side. Now, I think this diagnosis of the immediate causes of our current problems is correct. I believe that that's actually what we can identify. We certainly have a very fragile financial market in all countries, at least all countries that I know of, and we have a tendency toward exuberance on the side of investors, especially institutional investors. Now, where the schools of thought disagree is about the ultimate causes of the present crisis. So, while it is true that what has created the present meltdown of the markets, well, it has not entirely meltdown, the present difficulties are these two phenomena, the question is, why are the markets operating on such low equity ratios? Why are market participants so prone, financial market participants so prone for excessive risk-taking? According to our friends in the Keynesian camp and in other schools of thought, this seems to be something like a law of nature. It's a tendency that is simply just there. So it's silly to raise the question, why this is so? Just as it's silly to raise the question, why is the sky blue? Why does it rain today? Why is there this desk? Well, there's a statement that the desk is there and the sky is blue, that is now it's dark. And it's simply there. It's a fact of nature. And so are financial markets, according to them, simply operating at low equity ratios, and they are by their very nature exuberant. Now, that's not a very satisfactory response, because if we have financial difficulty, if we have a default, it falls back, in the first step certainly, on the person who has made the irresponsible decision. A bank that is operating on low equity and goes bankrupt, well, loses its capital and people lose their jobs and so on. So they have a self-interest in avoiding this kind of event. Why don't they act accordingly? That's a puzzle.